Hey yo, what's good? It's your boy Mixtape Moth, and today I'm gonna hit y'all with a list of what I consider to be 5 of the most disappointing hip hop albums from the 90s. Let's get to it. So, these are the projects that were highly anticipated from each of the respective artists slash groups, but ultimately they failed to meet expectations. These albums were what you could describe as mid for the time. Now, is that to say that these albums were completely trash or that they didn't have any good songs on them? The answer to that is absolutely not, but they were still viewed as letdowns, especially considering the hype surrounding each release. I'm sure there are going to be some folks who will say that an album on this list is a classic or that it was very slept on. And while that album may be a personal classic for you, or perhaps that album served as your introduction to that particular artist, the reality is that none of these albums were regarded as classics by the hip hop community. They just weren't. Not even close. You know, if you really lived through that era, then you will remember how these albums were perceived, and it wasn't in the most positive light. But getting right into this list in no particular order, but starting at number 5, I have Dr. Dre Presents The Aftermath, which dropped in 1996. This record label compilation is what Dr. Dre decided to follow up his legendary The Chronic album with. And what we essentially got was a watered down and experimental project that showcased the talents from Dr. Dre's new Aftermath label. There was a heavy R&B presence and not many beats actually done by Dre. Now, of course, there was his single Been There, Done That, which had a mature and polished sound. The single wasn't bad itself, but nothing as interestingly sonically as a single like, let's say, Keep Your Heads Ringing from the previous year. I would have to say that the best song from this compilation was East Coast West Coast Killers. That was an underrated track featuring Nas, KRS, Be Real, RBX that got heavy play from me in 1996. So while I think most people could support Dre's decision to leave the toxic Death Row Records at this time and his attempt at unifying the East and the West Coast, this album was still viewed as a dud. Out of all the stellar albums that dropped that year, I highly doubt that this would make anyone's best of 1996 list. At number 4, I have Snoop Dogg's The Dogfather, which also dropped in 1996. So The Dogfather was Snoop's highly awaited follow-up to his magnum opus Doggy Style. Except that Dr. Dre had nothing to do with this project, unlike his debut. Rather, the production was handled by Daz, Sam Snead, DJ Pooh, and Superfly. As a whole, these guys stuck to the G-Funk formula, but in a slightly duller and softer way. While there were some decent instrumentals here and there, they were far less memorable than any previous Death Row production. Of course, there were some highlights like Gold Rush, Vapors, Up Jump the Boogie, and Blueberry, songs that would make a Snoop playlist, no doubt, but overall, this album paled in comparison to the sounds found on projects like Murder Was the Case and Dog Food. Despite some decent storytelling and great flows from Snoop on here, it was just a lukewarm and underwhelming release. For number 3, I have Rayquazas' Immobility. So, Immobility, it's an interesting title, and you would have to be pretty well versed in mafia movie culture to understand its meaning, as the word immobility was taken from The Godfather 3, which was the least watched out of the Godfather trilogy by far. So this was Raekwon the Chef's second album and follow-up to his iconic, classic, and Smithsonian album, Only Built for Cuban Links, aka The Purple Tape, an album that many would argue is the best Wu-Tang solo project to drop and one of the best hip-hop albums of all time. But Immobility failed to meet expectations and was looked at as a major letdown for Wu-Tang fans. There was no RZA on the boards, unlike his debut. And I recall when I first learned that there was no RZA on Immobility, I was beside myself. There were also no appearances from Ghostface, which was a big deal, but I think RZA's absence was even more troublesome. Although context is key, And we have to keep in mind that by 1999, the RZA wasn't single-handedly producing Wu-Tang solo projects anymore. The bulk of the beats were being handled by affiliates. Now, in fairness, there were some dope songs with vivid storytelling from Ray on here. I feel lyrically he even improved from his 1995 debut, but few would give it the chance due to the stigma that was attached to this album. Despite some less than satisfactory beats, there were some strong ones like Sneakers, produced by Pete Rock. There were also the tracks Yayo and 100 Rounds, which were solid, even though 100 Rounds sounded like a poor man's version of It's Yours, and Live from New York, which was arguably the best song on the album. Even with my gripes about the production, I still go back and listen to some of the tracks since I am a big Raekwon fan. And out of all the albums on this most disappointing list, I consider this to be the least disappointing one. Still, if you bought this album back in 1999, there was a strong chance that you were dissatisfied. Luckily, Raekwon redeemed himself with Only Built for Cuban Links 2, an album that I hold in high regard and consider as the standards for how sequel albums should be constructed. For number 2, Nostradamus. Yeah, this one might be a bit cliche, but as a huge Nas fan, I wasn't impressed by it. This was Nas's 4th album and 2nd release from 1999. It had followed I Am, a project that some Nas fans consider a classic, even though it wasn't as good as his first 2. Now, Nostradamus was the byproduct of heavy bootlegging, which took place on I Am, and that was originally slated to be a double album. This forced Nas to scrap and record new songs quickly to meet the album's due date. The end result was somewhat of a mixed bag. Sure, there were good songs like Life We Chose, Come Get Me, Family, New World, and Project Windows. But there were also awkward commercial attempts that failed to leave a dent, like You Owe Me, Big Girl, and even Nostradamus. Now, the Nostradamus single wasn't bad, but not nearly as remarkable as previous hits. I understand that context matters, and this album kind of got a bad rap due to the bootlegging, but the reality is that it was not one of Nas's better releases. When revisiting this project, I typically only enjoy about 5 to 6 songs tops, and Nas is my favorite rapper of all time, so this is evidence that you can't win them all. And for number 1, I have Boot Camp Clicks for the People that came out in 1997. This was the long-awaited debut album from the Brooklyn supergroup Boot Camp Clicks. Even though factions within the crew like Smith & Wesson, Black Moon, and OGC had dropped classics in the mid-90s like Enter the Stage, The Shining, and The Storm, this would be their first album together as a supergroup. Now, despite the high expectations leading into this project, it was a huge letdown for fans expecting a continuation of that rugged Bucktown sound. Rather than using the beat miners, they opted for live instrumentation and slightly polished keyboard melodies. However, in fairness, the lyrical quality did not falter here. In fact, members brought their A game as far as the rapping was concerned, but the smoothed out production sound wasn't what fans were prepared to hear from the Fatigue rockin' and Timberland stomping crew. I have a theory, and I could be completely wrong, but a possibility for their change in sound at this time might have been the result of their collaborations with Tupac. Perhaps he inspired them to take a slightly different route. I'm not sure, but it was clear that they were trying to evolve sonically, and fans were not ready for that sharp transition. I'm a big Boot Camp fan, but out of all the great albums to drop in 1997, unfortunately, this wasn't one of them. Now, for the honorable mentions, because there were some more albums in the 90s that come to mind that could be looked at as missteps or blunders. One that stands out immediately was Cannabis's debut album, Can I Bust, from 1998. So prior to this release, Cannabis was one of the most highly anticipated artists to emerge from the late 90s next to DMX. From his mixtape Freestyles to the LL Beef and his second round knockout disc, Cannabis was in very high demand in 1998. But then his debut album, which was largely produced by Wyclef, had dropped and it wasn't that well received, primarily due to stale production. And then there are others which stand out. Now, these projects aren't necessarily bad, but they are a bit underwhelming. The Firm album, Nori's Melvin Flint the Hustler, Mike Geronimo's Vendetta, John Forte's Poli Sci, Rampage the Last Boy Scout, Scouts Honored by Way of Blood, and even Craig Mack's Operation Get Down, if people were checking for that. I actually like most of the Firm album and Mike Geronimo's Vendetta, but I do understand some of the criticism that those projects received at the time. So those are some albums that could have been so much more. Let me know in the comment section some of the ones you consider to be the most disappointing from the 90s. It's your boy Mixtape Moth. I'm signing out, but be sure to hit that like button and please subscribe. As always, it's peace and blessings. Top 5 most disappointing albums from the 90s. 1.